Okay, good morning everybody. Let me do a couple evidence table examples for you. So this is Unit H, and the assignment here is that you're going to submit an evidence table, and it goes into detail about that. You have a research evaluation table template, and you have a non-research, and you shouldn't see this one on your Canvas because I don't have it posted there. But I do this. This is what you're going to use to apply the level and quality of evidence. Okay, let me just go there so you can see it. And we can go back. Whoa, that's not good. Go back to it, and that's huge. So this is the Johns Hopkins Evidence Level and Quality Guide, and this is what we're going to use. There are several different ones out there, and in real life you can use whatever you want. Like I had told some of the students I had talked to Wednesday, I use the AACN one. It doesn't matter. So, but for this purposes, this was fairly simple, so we just assigned you the Johns Hopkins. Okay, so let's go to the research table, or the research evidence table. I know it says evaluation table, but I think more commonly it's actually called an evidence table, so that's what I say. So this is the template you're going to use. The purpose of this is to prepare yourself for your lit review, and it's a way to keep data organized, and because your lit review is coming up, and that's the culmination activity of this course, and it's not easy to write. Both of these you'll carry over to your 6800 project or your master's project. And let me see here. Okay, let me find the article. So I'm going to do a qualitative one. So this is a qualitative one. A role construction, boundaries, and interprofessional primary healthcare teams, a qualitative study. This is really nice because right off the bat it tells you a qualitative study. Okay, remember, if you don't know what it is, you're going to have to look at the background. And by the way, this methods does tell us more specifically what type of qualitative study it is. So that's important to get into your table as well. And then you can do a deep dive into the article, into methods, and find out more about what type of study it is if you don't know. It uses a holistic comparative case study approach to explore. Whenever you hear the words explore, pretty much you know that you're on a qualitative track, okay? Okay, so the abstract generally tells you much information, but you know, you always do need to read the whole article, especially when you're looking forward to your lit review. Okay, so here's my authors. Title, and the article was 213. Okay, so when I go to my evidence table, all I do is cut and paste my authors, my date, and my title in there. The next thing I'm going to move on to is purpose and problem. The thing you need to remember is your purpose and problem. And it doesn't matter if you write a problem. I mean, I did, because to me it just helps me understand more so what the article is doing or what the researchers are trying to do. It takes a few times to read some of these things sometimes, I swear. So, but always make sure your purpose ties in with your data analysis. So whatever you put for the purpose, your results need to make sure that they match up to that, okay? Alright, so the purpose was to aim to understand how roles are constructed within interprofessional healthcare teams in primary care. The problem was that interprofessional role construction can result in a separation of responsibilities, but also role blurring. And there were specifically 2 research questions addresses this, and I didn't write that in there, but let me show you. So here's the purpose. It just talks about how is role construction done, and then it talks a little bit more about elucidating or clarifying the different types of role boundaries, influences, and implications, which, by the way, I do address in the findings or the results. So if I go in and I can do a deep dive here, remember your background or your introduction always talks a little bit more about specifically what they did. Hey, I couldn't understand what they were talking about with role construction, so I really had to go in there and I had to highlight that for myself. And that's, you know, it's important to know what the heck they're talking about. So I will always either highlight that in my article or at least put a definition into the evidence table if I don't know what they're talking about. So anyways, it just talks a little bit more about the boundaries, so you can certainly understand what it is they're talking about, which I definitely had to read. So they had 2 questions that guided the study, and they were, overall it was how are roles constructed, more specifically, what types of role boundaries are present within an interprofessional team, and what are the influences on the construction of roles. So those two questions, this was the overarching, these two, these are the things I actually tried to answer in the results section. Okay? All right, let's go back to the evidence table. So this was a qualitative, so I wrote my problem right there. And then the design and method was a qualitative comparative case study, which is important, right? You know, be specific. Comparative, sometimes it's going to be a qualitative grounded theory approach, but this was a comparative case study. And there, I wrote in there that they did 2 healthcare teams. That was their comparative case study. So they did they assessed 2 healthcare teams. So the sample size in the study setting, sample size, that size is always your N at the end. How many participants actually participated in the study? And here it was N26. Their sample size, or their study setting, it was 2 primary care teams. One was led by nurse practitioners, and one was a independent physician led. And they were from 2 different provinces in Canada. But the thing was, is they did work under similar regulatory frameworks, which is important because you can't compare apples to oranges. It really needs to be apples to apples. So they did. We'll go back to the article here in a second. The major variable study, as you read through, you'll see that they were talking about the teams themselves, the interprofessional healthcare teams, the role boundaries, and role construction. Okay. So let's go here. So if I want to know, you go into your methods and you can look at a little bit more. These were the 2 cases. It talked about similarities, which is very important, NPs, registered nurses, all that who is on the team, because we want the similarities there to be able to compare. Here's team 1. It was independent physicians. Team 2 was an NP-led team. And that is important information. So that is your setting. And here is where I found the N. Team 1 was 13, Team 2 was 13. So it's an N of 26. Okay. So before we flip back to the table, I want to talk a little bit about data collection. It was interviews, observations, and written documents. They had a protocol. They go into more detail about the interviews. They talk about the written documents, what all that was. So this is good information. They are very clear about it. When you go back to your analysis, this is, you just want to make sure, was this really credible or bona fide? And it really was. This was a good study. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Okay, I thought it was interesting, I should say. Okay, so here was, again, the major variables. The measurement of the variables, I just wrote in there, it wasn't semi-structured. I don't know where I got that. You just need to write interviews, written documents, and observations. For your lit review, you'll go into a little bit more detail about that. Okay, so the data analysis, again, which is results, too. I don't know why we... Oh, here's the results. Quant is your statistical findings. Qualitative is your themes and all that. Okay, so first of all, what was really cool is they developed a comprehensive model. That was really neat. Usually when we do qualitative studies, we do that with grounded theory, but that was kind of nice with this one. Okay, so we were talking about the roles. They had 2 dimensions, autonomous and collaborative, and then the second dimension was interchangeable and differentiated. They found that role construction had positive implications for professional satisfaction and for patients. That was identified in the model specifically. They talked about the influences, which was addressed in the abstract, and the different influences were structural, interpersonal, and individual influences on boundaries. And I had to give myself some examples. And by the way, to be able to, of course, understand it, I had to read the whole article. But they talked about autonomy. It was important to the overall team functioning. But if people were extremely autonomous, there were some negative implications with that. They talked about influences such as positional power. That can be positively used and negatively, but positively to empower people to develop their responsibilities, their interactions, and their own autonomy too. Interchangeable roles, that was a positive thing, but it also had some negative influences just because blurring. And I don't know what that was. But under each one of these, there were several themes identified. I didn't write them all out, but they were there. So when I want to go back for my lit review, I know they're there. So let me go here really quick. So to data analysis, iterative process, important. They talk about how they went through this whole analyses and finding the information. So it was really important. This talks about this. This level of analysis allowed us to identify a range of influence and then expand more on their importance. So I thought it was really, they did a nice job. They talked about transparency, ethics, which is always important. And then here's their results. This was what was cool. They had a comprehensive model that actually fell out of all this, of the interviews, the observations. So that's really kind of neat. They talked about the different boundaries, differentiation, or the dimensions. Let me see here. Collaborative, these were the two dimensions, collaborative and autonomy. And then there was the dimension of interchangeable and differentiated. That's why I wrote it up there. They talked about the influence, structural, and what themes now were under those, workloads and turnover. I didn't put that in there. I said there were themes there. And then they talked about interpersonal influences, which I addressed. And then they talked about trust and leadership. Those are the themes. And then individual influences. And that was important as well. And see, under these themes, they give you actual comments, which is important in qualitative studies. Okay, then it goes on to talk about implications. And they give some more examples of that. They talked about the collaborative endeavors versus, I think, a little bit more about the autonomy. I won't go into this. Let me see here. The role boundaries. And then here's the discussion, finally. Here is the discussion, which they talked a little bit more about the role boundaries, the implications, and the influences. So they did a really nice job with their discussion, I have to say. They talked about the limitations and all that, but let's go back to the table. So the appraisal, strengths and limitation, their study, I think their strength was that they really did well with their data analysis processes, and they did well with explaining it. And that really, it didn't leave me really with any questions. Generalizability, yes, that may be limited since they compared two cases in Canada, but still, the transferability, you could pull that out and still use it in some of your own practice settings, and especially based on the model. So I felt they did a really nice job with that. I think for applicability to whatever your PICO or your professional practice, I think the insight into the roles and the boundaries is always important to understand, especially when we're talking about autonomy versus blurring of roles, which we see with MDs and nurse practitioners. There's a little bit of angst oftentimes on the MD's part. The evidence rating, I gave it a 3 and I gave it an AB for the John Hopkins things. And why? Let me go back here. 3 because it didn't fall into any of these categories. Experimental is 1, explanatory, systematic review of RCTs. Quasi, I would have thought that would have been up there, but that's okay. So the qualitative, it falls in here. It's a non-experimental study. Remember, non-experimental. Experimental means a random controlled study, or quasi at times too. It's a little bit different, but yeah. And then I gave it an AB because if you read through here, they did a really nice job of transparency, diligence, verification. They did a really nice job of explaining their whole data analysis. Okay, so that's all I have for the qualitative, and I will post the article as well.